Thank you for inviting me to come to speak to you about basically the work that I do with Arab Americans and our work in American politics, the challenges that we face, and the successes that we have had. I want to do a little context setting. We had a huge day on Tuesday. There was not just victories for Democrats in Virginia and New Jersey. It really was more than that. It was a rejection of Trump and Trumpism. If you go below the surface of what happened in those elections, most people could not tell you the names of the candidates who won the governorships in both states. Even in Virginia, people were asked after the election to name the candidate they voted for, and they couldn't remember. 57% of those who voted for Ralph Northam said that they were actually voting against Donald Trump. The number was higher in New Jersey, and it wasn't just against Donald Trump, but it was also against Chris Christie, whose favorability rating was, I think, 15% before the election. More significant than the candidate they voted for is why they voted and other down ballot candidates that they also voted for. For example, let's just look at New Jersey for a minute. Democrats flipped the state house in Virginia. Likely we will. We won 14 seats. We had to flip 17. There are 5 that are being recounted, and we stand a good chance of winning them. It's who won that's important. A transgender woman won, beating the guy who wrote the ban transgender bill on the Republican side, and also sponsored Islamophobic legislation. He was a high-ranking member of the Republican group in the state house. She beat him. She beat him rather handily. A Democratic Socialist won, beating the number 2 in the Republican House of Delegates. He ran without support from the state party. He ran with Bernie Sanders' support. And he ran with a true activist base that helped usher him in. In so many races, both delegate races, but also in the governor's race, the issues of Trumpism were on the agenda. Ed Gillespie ran Islamophobic ads. He ran anti-transgender and anti-gay ads. He also ran against immigrants and the danger, the violence that immigrants bring to America, and was soundly defeated for it. People didn't vote for Ralph Northam. They actually voted against the agenda of the Republican Party, and that's significant for us to understand. It also impacted ballots across the country. First Sikh mayor in Hoboken, New Jersey. In Dearborn, not only did Arab Americans retain control of city council, but they began to get a foothold in Dearborn Heights, which is suburban Dearborn. Let me just tell you the story there. When we started the Institute in 1985, we were all ready to gear up for the '88 presidential campaign. We grew out of the Jesse Jackson 1984 campaign. We saw Arab Americans for the first time be welcomed in American politics, but by the Jackson campaign only. They were not welcome in the broader Democratic Party, and it was a challenge. And so we thought we're going to gear up for the '88 campaign and see what we can do to elect delegates and get people empowered in politics. We started voter registration drives. We started to form Arab American Democratic clubs and Republican clubs, and we began to do all the work you need to do to empower yourself in America. No sooner did we launch the Institute than we got a desperate call from Dearborn from a woman who was running for city council who said, the mayor just sent a tabloid to everybody's home in the city. It had 2 sides to it with New York Daily News headlines. You know those 2-inch things that scream at you? One side said what to do about the playgrounds and what to do about the recreation parks, which was coded for black people coming in to the city. Dearborn was all white. Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, built Dearborn as a utopian community, i.e. it was all white. The workers lived on one side, the management lived on the other side, and this huge factory was in the middle. No blacks in Dearborn, and so what blacks would do would come into the parks on weekends. They're public parks. Because it was a problem for the white Dearborn residents, he said, I'm going to run on keeping them out. The second side was what to do about the Arab problem. At that time, in 1985, in Dearborn, Michigan, there were 19,000 Arabs in a city of 93,000 people. They were recent immigrants, mostly from South Lebanon. They had come after the Israeli occupation of, in particular, Bint Jbeil and Dibnin, which were two villages that were literally emptied out into Dearborn. And they were just new in the city. The mayor, as you read down the article, it was, we have all these new people coming here. They don't share our values, they don't share our culture, and they're ruining our way of life. People were shell-shocked. I mean, as anybody would, being defined as a problem, being defined as violating the sanctity of Dearborn's culture, whatever the hell that was supposed to mean. So I went to Dearborn, gave a pep talk to a big rally that we had that night saying, you're not the problem, you're going to be the promise of the city, and we're going to do what we can do. Next day we went over to the city clerk to get the voter rolls to begin preparing for the election. We found 700 registered voters. 700 registered voters out of 19,000 people. And my response to the community the next day when we met was, if you're that big and you have that little power, you are bound to be picked on and you have no ability to defend yourself. We started our voter registration drive. 10 years later, we were up to 7,000 registered voters. That same guy came to our event, speaking a little Arabic, gave me the key to the city, which actually wasn't the key, it was the mesbah of the city. He had them made in South Lebanon, specially for honorary guests that he wanted to bestow the honor of Dearborn on. I also got a key, though. I mean, you got to get the key. It's kind of like symbolic of something. When my kids were little, they used to think it actually opened something, but it doesn't. I was sitting next to a guy at the Clinton White House. I told him the story of this guy, and when he began with my dear brothers and sisters and quoted from the Quran and then went on to give me the key, I sat back next to Bob, who was the African-American guy at the White House, and he looked over me and he said, son of a bitch knows how to count, huh? Because he had 6,000 something registered voters. Today, these elections, president of the city council is an Arab American woman. 4 of the 7 are Arab American. When they became affluent enough to move out of Dearborn, they moved to Dearborn Heights. Same problem. They're coming into our city, they're invading our town, we're the suburbs, whatever. We just elected a couple Arab Americans in Dearborn Heights. And the story repeats around the country. We had victories almost everywhere. Latinos had victories almost everywhere. 6 transgender folks won. 16 socialists won, people who ran avowedly on, I mean, in other words, if you look at the picture of who won across the country, you see a change, significant change in the electorate and who the electorate was supporting, precisely because they were rejecting the divisiveness and the anxiety that was created by the divisiveness of the Trump era. I say that as a start because it's important to see kind of where we are and understand our community in the context of the broader national discourse. As I said, when we began our work back 30-something years ago, there really was no organized Arab American political constituency. It didn't exist. There had been a Syrian Lebanese for Carter committee. There had been a Lebanese for Reagan committee. There'd never been an Arab American committee until Jesse Jackson came along. What moved people to organize as Arab Americans was not, as some would have thought, as some sort of accusatorily said, it was kind of a Nasserism or a Baathism. It actually had nothing to do with that. It was first generation, my generation, who grew up, who basically didn't know or care where you came from, what your faith was, but that we shared a common heritage. And out of that, we bonded as a community, and Jackson was the conveyor belt that brought us into politics. I remember one time, Rami, a Lebanese ambassador, whose name I will not mention, came to my office and said, "How do you organize your staff?" I said, "We got our organizing unit over here and our research unit there and our administrative." He said, no, how do you organize your staff? And I said, "I don't know what you mean, by function?" He said, no, the guy sitting out front, he's Shia from South Lebanon, huh? I said, "Actually, I have no idea because I never asked him." And he said, no, how many do you have? He wanted to know how many Sunni, how many Shia, how many Iraqi, how many Lebanese. I had no clue. Unless the kid's name was George or Muhammad, I didn't know. And then I have an uncle Mahmoud, and so I guess it gets confusing anyway. So it just was not an issue for us. And it stayed that way. It stayed that way for a number of years. What first began to break it up was the first Gulf War. Because we had been able to build a coalition within the community of recent immigrants who felt empowered, and the first and second generation born here who felt a sense of, I can identify with this and work with this. But when the Gulf War happened and the countries of the Middle East divided, the immigrant community broke as they divided in the region. So Syrians were on one side, Palestinians were on the other side, and their feud became one that broke the community apart. We had a detour from our work at the Institute and started focusing on building social service and community capacity because we couldn't do politics because the divisions in the community were too great. Well, we succeeded in changing that over the next decade or so. 9/11 happened. Frankly, if we had not succeeded over that decade in reconstructing the community, 9/11 would have buried us. It would have buried us. And I remember being invited by the Japanese American community to speak at an event at the Japanese American War Memorial sometime like 7-8 days after 9/11. I was there. If you've never been to the Japanese American War Memorial in Washington, you really should see it. It's quite stunning. It's Zen-like. It's very quiet, peaceful, and yet it tells a story of the camps that they were interned in that period. And the fear, if you recall back then in the community, was that would happen to us. There was a sense that that could happen. But as I stood there speaking to this large crowd that included 33 different organizations, 7 senators, a number of congressmen, most of the major Protestant church leaders, and the Catholic cardinal, I said to myself, this could not happen to us because we have built relationships over the past decades that protect us and brought us a degree of security and acceptance in America that we had not had before, and that Japanese Americans did not have in 1940. When they were carted off to the camps, there was no one to defend them. But we had major institutions defending us at that point, that saying this will not happen to them. And it succeeded, and it continued. In the most difficult days of the Bush administration, everybody remembers George Bush said, you know, Muslims are our neighbors, whatever. But the policies he pursued moved in exactly the opposite direction. They began profiling, they began arresting and detaining, they began deporting, they began typing Arabs and Muslims as a threat to America, despite what the president was saying. And it was difficult, but we had allies who protected us and gave us the capacity to endure during that period. President Obama was elected in 2008, and it was a fascinating election. My PhD works in religion, and my postdoctoral work is in anthropology, and it was the study of religion and society under stress. What happens under stress? One of the things that happens is that something called revitalization movements occur. People sort of rejigger their thinking to address the stress. And in most instances, what happens with these revitalization movements is that There's a sort of a prophet who comes along who promises to reconstruct the golden era, the way we were. The famous one is the ghost dance, where the Indian tribe who had been pushed from the Delaware Basin across to Oregon had a prophet who occurred in their midst who said, if we dance the dance of the ancestors, and if we continue and persist, all the ancestors will return and the buffalo will return. We'll march across the continent and push the white men back into the waters from whence they came. Well, they danced and they danced, and it was a totally peaceful movement, but they danced and they danced and they made so much racket that the cavalry came down and massacred them. It didn't work, in other words. But this sense of returning to a golden past, usually a past that never was, sort of a fictive past, is what usually happens under enormous stress. So here we had 2008 and the collapse of the economy. And we should not forget how absolutely severe it was. Unemployment doubled in a period of 3 months. There was at least 1 in 5 homes under foreclosure. They were underwater. Biggest problem was people's pension plans. 30 to 40% of their pension plans evaporated as the stock market collapsed. And there was this enormous stress to the culture, and you had 2 distinct characters running for president. It wasn't just that one was white and one was black, one was old and one was young. One represented that kind of dying greatest generation where patriotism meant you put on a uniform and you fight for your country, and it was sort of the Ronald Reagan Old West when men were men and women were women, and that's what he represented. And he had a running mate who sort of advocated quite vocally that position. And then you had this guy with a funny name who people thought was a Muslim who promised hope. And I can tell you, I do not recall a single instance in my study of revitalization movements where hope wins. And yet it did. The problem is that it won. And it won so resoundingly that an entire cohort of people were shocked to their core. They woke up after the inauguration and they said, wait a minute, I lost 20% or 30, 40% of my income. I am not sure I'm going to keep my job. My kids can't get a job. My house is under foreclosure. And they elected one of them. The Tea Party grew up out of this reaction to the election of Barack Obama simply because he was black. And with it came the birther movement, which, make no mistake about it, was not just black and foreign, but was Muslim. He's not one of us. And the impact was severe in the entire culture. Even till this day, over 60% of Republicans say Barack Obama was not born in America. Over 60% of Republicans say Barack Obama, they believe he's a Muslim. Islamophobia, which did not develop to the intensity that it has most recently, after 9/11, in the polling that we've done, people continued for years after 9/11 to keep an open mind toward Muslims, towards Arabs in America. After the election of Barack Obama, they became an incredible split in the culture. 70% of Democrats saying, I like them. 70% of Republicans saying, I don't trust them, I hate them. They're frightening, they scare me, they're a danger to America. Created a new threat. We've always faced threats in our community, always faced threats. Some of the threats have been external, like that. The threat of phobias, the threat of fear of alien culture, the product of the propaganda campaign that the Israelis have waged for 2 generations now, since they made the film The Exodus, which typecast Arabs as the savages and the murderers and the terrorists. I mean, it became such that the word Palestinian and terrorist became synonymous. You can substitute one for the other. Arab terrorist, synonymous, one for the other. Tied to the Arab-Israeli conflict. After 9/11, the gears shifted and it became Muslim and terrorists. And after the election of Barack Obama, it even intensified more. So that actually, before 9/11, the numbers were here. After 9/11, they stayed flat. And they continued to stay flat. By the time you got to 2010, they dropped to the floor. It was Republicans deliberately using a campaign of vilification of Muslims. You remember the Victory Mosque? The National Republican Congressional Coalition, the NRCC, they actually made a campaign nationally targeting Democrats with wanting to build a Victory Mosque in New York. It had an impact. 2012, you had 5 of the Republican candidates for president saying they wouldn't have a Muslim in their administration unless they took a special loyalty oath. Stayed in 2014, and in 2016, it was there again in full with the candidate running for president saying it as well. That external threat was real and took a toll on the community. I'll describe it in a minute. We also faced internal threats. The internal challenges that we faced, I told you about the Gulf War in 1990, it was a problem within the community as we divided generationally, generation being the generation born in the States versus the generation whose identity was Arab, or Syrian or Lebanese or whatever. I mean, in some ways, before I became active in Arab organizing, I was running the Palestine Human Rights Campaign in the 70s, the Lebanese Civil War took a huge toll on the community. Huge toll. I mean, I'm about as Lebanese Christian as you could come, as you could get. I'm both mother and father come from the same damn village in Jebel, Lebanon, and grew up Maronite, stayed Maronite, but I was Palestinian. You're not one of us. You are Palestinian. And I was rejected by my uncles. You don't love us, you love them. And at one point, one of my uncles said, because her mother came from the nearby village, Baskinta, which there was a problem between my father's village and mother's village, whatever. He said, we understand why. Your mother's from Baskinta, and we know what they're like. Those kind of internal things plagued us, but we had overcome many of them only to be revisited with them when we got to the Gulf War. Arab Spring did it all over again. It did it all over again. With the recent immigrant community breaking up again over pro this, anti that, pro Bashar, anti Bashar, pro Mubarak, anti Mubarak, seeing themselves not as American, but seeing themselves living in exile. And that issue of being in exile and identifying with factions, which was a problem in the 70s, something we overcame in the 80s, we went through it again in the 90s, but then we were visited upon it again by the Arab Spring, which, despite the fact that I wanted to be able to celebrate this effort at renewal in the region, it ended up becoming a divisive issue within the community. As people's sense of identity shifted from being part of a community to being a person in exile supporting a cause on one side or another over there, and not seeing it as an American, but rather seeing it as a factional component over there. Then the religion issue became one too, a huge division. In the same way that during the Lebanese Civil War, people would say, I am not Arab, I'm Christian. We now had people saying to us, we're not Arab, we're Muslim. And we will only identify that way and not this way. And I began being called the Christian Arab. When President Obama appointed me to the U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom, only 2 groups opposed my nomination, one Jewish group and one Muslim group. Jewish group because I was an Arab, the Muslim group because I was Christian. You laugh, but it was a serious problem within the community, with people again asking the question of the ambassador, the Lebanese ambassador, how many Muslims do you have on staff? And do they cover? Do your women cover? I have women on staff who are Muslims, some cover, some don't. I don't hire them based on whether they cover or not. I don't hire them based on whether they're from Lebanon or Iraq or Syria. We hire them because they're of Arab descent and they want to serve the community. And the community is one where we do not distinguish that. Now, what I'm pleased to tell you is that in the victories that we won this year, maybe because Trumpism is such an enormous threat, people didn't give a shit. What religion you were, what country you came from, they were voting in people who they saw as representative of their community. And that's where we are today. Still confronting the internal challenges, still confronting the external challenges, but trying our best to overcome them and move forward. Do I feel confident that we'll survive it, the threats? I do. I do, because it's actually what we do in America. It's actually part of the good part of being America. I got invited to speak at a synagogue about 12 years ago. In the wake of 9/11, the rabbi wanted me to come speak about the backlash. A couple of famous cases. 3 people went to jail after 9/11 for threatening my life, and they became pretty big in the press and back then. And so he wanted me to, actually one of them was up here in Boston. We had to come here for the trial. Went to jail for 2 years. He left messages, I know where you live, you Arab raghead. He called, why did they put Arab and raghead together? I got a couple threats back when in the 1970s, Arab raghead. Seems to be like the term of art, you know? So you can't just say Arab, it's got to be dirty or raghead. So you got to add an adjective or something else to it. You Arab raghead, I know where you live, you Arab raghead. I'll murder you and slit the throats of your children. So I went to the trial here in Boston at the federal court, and the judge asked me to reconsider before sentencing because he was a good family man. And to which I responded, he might be a good family man, but you don't say to other people, I'm going to slit the throats of your children. That kind of takes you out of the good family man category right now. I want the son of a bitch to go to jail. And he did. The judge accused me of having no compassion. I'm sorry, but back then I went to the synagogue, and the rabbi said, I want you to talk about the backlash. I said, I'd be happy to. He said, I don't want you to talk about the Middle East. I said, okay. He called me 3 times. There's a lot of trouble here at the synagogue. People are really upset that I invited you. Please don't talk about the Middle East. I said, I won't talk about that, I promise you. 3rd time I said, if you don't want me to come, just disinvite me. We'll all be happy. I don't need this anyway. No, we want you to come, just don't talk. I didn't talk about the Middle East. I talked about the backlash. Every question I got was about the Middle East. And it was just fine. We had an interesting conversation until the last question came up. And the last question was, do you believe in mixed marriage in America? Old guy asked the question. I was like thinking there's a trick here someplace, you know, it's like there's something going on. So I thought for a minute and I said, my mother and father came from the same village in Lebanon, but my mother's mother was from Baskinta. And my father's family never quite accepted that. It was a good thing. And so I guess that was a mixed marriage. I'm Lebanese Catholic, my wife is Irish Catholic. My mother-in-law never accepted the fact that I was really Catholic because it wasn't the same, right? That was a mixed marriage. I have a son who's married to a Muslim. I have a daughter who's married to a Jew. I have another son who's married to a Baptist and a daughter married to a Methodist, and I have a gay daughter, and I don't know who she's going to marry, but I guess I do believe in mixed marriage. We call it America. The audience divided. Old people were outraged, and the young people thought it was just the coolest thing ever. But it's the American story. And frankly, I think that despite all of these currents of unrest and the currents of division and the waves that we go through periodically, the tide of change ultimately wipes out all of those divisive currents and transforms us. Because that's who we are. That's where the currents are. It was a glitch. It was a disastrous glitch. It was a huge problem for the culture and for the world. But what I saw on Tuesday was the beginning of the end of that. Now, I've got some problems in the Democratic Party. They got to wake up and figure out how to deal with this better. We've got some reform proposals put forward. And I hope we'll actually end up winning because you may not know, I was Bernie Sanders' policy advisor during the campaign, and I'm on the Unity and Reform Commission as a Sanders appointee. We got some problems, and we have to deal with them. But I think we will overcome them in the party, but I think we'll overcome them in the country, and I think we'll overcome them in the community. Because what I'm seeing right now is a generation of young people coming into my office who are the same that I was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, maybe 50 years ago. 72 next week. I'm an old man. No, not till next week. I got to make it yet. I got a week to go. No, I mean, it's fascinating watching the waves, you know? I mean, there's a generation today coming on board with the same cultural experience that I had, born here, but with an identity shaped by their culture and heritage, without a sense of, I'm from this faction or that faction, simply wanting to serve the community. We have these events at my office once a month, and it's striking to see. They actually come with a head start because there wasn't a commitment to public service with my generation. I mean, I'm from the generation where I was I was an activist from I was civil rights, anti-war, and then I went into Arab stuff. My mother always said, why? She said, if you'd been a foot doctor, your uncles would say, how smart. They'd show me their bunion, and I'd tell them what to do, and they'd say, see, you did a good job with the boy. But no, you had to go into politics where they all know more than you do, and they're not going to listen to you. That was how the culture was, but it's changed now. Right now in Washington, when I came to Washington, there were like 4 people in Washington doing this kind of work full time. Now there's over 100. And there's hundreds more working in Congress, working in journalism, working in the different agencies of government, working for NGOs on everything from working with, I mean, Amnesty International would not take an Arab case back in 1970s. They wouldn't touch Palestine with a 10-foot pole. They would do it in London, but they wouldn't touch it in Washington or in the States because it was too controversial. Now they got Arab Americans working at Amnesty and taking these cases right and left. Amnesty's come out and supported BDS. That would not have happened a generation ago. ACLU is doing stuff all over the country, would not have touched it. Taking on BDS cases wouldn't have touched them 30, 40 years ago. And they've got Arab American lawyers on staff handling the casework. It's a huge difference. And I just happen to believe that the momentum is there, that despite the setbacks, we move forward. To me, the Dearborn story is emblematic of where we're going in the country and where the community is going. And I'll leave you with that and take any questions you have.